software are from our EPA Midwest region in Chicago, Chris Newman and Brianna Bill. Both are regional Federal Green Challenge coordinators. Before we begin our presentations, I'll go over some logistics. This is a recorded session. You will receive a link and a follow-up thank you for participating in the email. Also, we will try to have posted on the Federal Green Challenge previous webinar webpage the link to the recording as well as the presentations, and the recording will be up for about 30 days for those of us who want to tell someone else they can listen to it. We will post the webinar presentations of the session as well. It should be available within a week, and that's probably as long as I can, probably shorter than that, but it'll be a while. You can reach the page by going to http://www.epa.gov/Federal Green Challenge, which is not on the screen at this point. I will put the correct web link up as soon as possible. You may experience a short delay on your screen when the slides are advanced. If you have any difficulty seeing or hearing the presentation, let us know by typing your issue into the chat box, and we will assist you. Please type the questions about the speaker's presentations into the chat box also. Available on your GoToWebinar dashboard. There's no need to wait until the end of the presentation if you have one during the middle of the presentation. You can just type them in, and then we will have a question and answer time later on. We will not be using the raise your hand feature today, and if we don't respond to the questions online, we will email you a response later if we have your email. Also, a short survey will pop up after the webinar, and we would very much appreciate you taking a couple of minutes to provide feedback. It's very short. Before we start our presentation, we are going to have another quick survey to see how many are participating in the webinar currently. We will have a few minutes. We have 2 speakers instead of 3 today, unfortunately. Our third speaker had a family emergency and will not be on. If we can present that at a later time, we will. The Federal Green Challenge Web Academy presentations are designed to offer guidance on different aspects of the Federal Green Challenge or related topics. Today, we are continuing our topics on aspects of implementing the Executive Order 13693, Planning for Federal Sustainability in the Future. Food recovery, which includes practices such as purchasing less food, donation of edible food, and composting, all of which and more can significantly reduce our waste to landfills. Is the survey up, Chris?
Yeah, the survey's been completed.
Okay, we can go on?
Yes.
Okay. The Federal Green Challenge, if you don't already know, commits federal facilities to a minimum of 5% annual reduction in 2 of the 6 target areas, one of which must be waste purchasing or electronics. The Federal Green Challenge supports executive order requirements, and we currently have over 450 participants. A key element with the executive order is to advance waste prevention and pollution prevention by diverting at least 50% of the non-hazardous solid waste, including food and compostable material. So the Federal Green Challenge is also one of 3 challenges, which include the Food Recovery Challenge and the Electronics Challenge. If you don't already, we encourage your agency or facility to sign up for the Federal Green Challenge and commit to reducing your environmental impact. The second challenge that we will be kind of skirting on the edge is the Food Recovery Challenge. Up until this point, EPA has not actively engaged federal facilities in this food challenge. However, there are a number of food challenge participants who are federal food service providers, and a partnership between the federal facilities contracts and a food service providers or concessioners is a perfect integration of the two challenges. The food recovery challenges include groups such as grocers, educational institutions, restaurants, faith organizations, sports and entertainment venues, and hospitality businesses. Any business or organization can join the Federal Food Recovery Challenge as a participant or an endorser. Participants prevent and divert wasted food in their operations, and they follow the food hierarchy, which we'll be talking about later. Endorsers promote sustainable management of food by educating organizations and businesses about environmental costs of wasted food and recruiting other organizations into the Food Recovery Challenge. EPA's also has a number of toolkits, and I know Darby and you're going to talk a little bit about the food recovery hierarchy, so I'm just going to go on. They have tools for assessing wasted food, and that is the EPA website. And we also have Food Too Good to Waste, a toolkit that can help families plan meals ahead and safely store leftovers, helping reduce food waste and saving time and money at the grocery store. Food that's no longer safe to eat can be composted, and that keeps nutrients in our garden landfills. Businesses are playing a vital role by joining nearly 800 organizations taking part in this food recovery challenge. By keeping track of food inventories and setting food waste prevention goals, businesses can lower purchase and waste disposal costs and avoid wasted employee time and improve bottom lines. And you will learn about that and best practices in our next presentation. Some of the major organizations that are actually part of this food challenge are Disneyland, MGM Resorts International, Nestle's, and a hockey team, National Hockey League, are a few of the participants. We will have a food recovery summit in November to gather stakeholders to advance the initiative. Well, what do we know about wasted food? We know quite a lot, but yet we need to know a lot more. In 2013, there were more than 37 million tons of food wasted, of generated food was wasted. Of total food wasted generated, 5%, only 5% was diverted from municipal solid waste stream. On September 16th, EPA and USDA announced a national food loss and waste reduction goal calling for 50% reduction by 2030. So we are looking at partnerships to reduce some of the things, and I know Darby will talk a little bit about the food waste percentages, but it's amazing just how much food loss we have in the U.S. and that can be prevented. The goal of the 50% reduction by 2030 emphasizes the importance of this issue and how the government needs to take a leadership in that drive towards waste reduction, and how essential our partnerships are with charitable organizations, faith-based organizations, private sector, state, local, and tribal governments to reduce food loss and waste in order to improve security of food and conserve resources. This webinar will highlight the type of key partnerships and will outline why federal food purchasing matters and how to include food recovery into strategic planning and food service contracts and leases. It will also feature at a later time an example of 2 national parks that are actually doing that. The federal government, as you know, is one of the largest purchasers in the world and one of the largest food purchasers as well. The U.S. Department of Agriculture, the U.S. Department of Defense, Bureau of Prisons, National Park Service, and the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs are among the largest federal purchasers of food services. They spend at least $4.27 billion of food on food each year. And other agencies such as GSA, USDA, Veterans Hospitals, National Park Service, all have exemplary efforts that are ongoing that we hope to bring to you in the future. Many are adopting comprehensive strategies to reduce, recover, and divert wasted food and associated organics. Federal actions can have a really significant impact on sustainable food management. Benefits people, environments, and budgets. The government contracts out its food services no matter where the government facility is located. This necessitates collaboration with businesses and governments and consumers. Also, a very important part of the objectives of the executive order is to collaborate with local communities, businesses, and governments. It is one of the overarching policy directives, that of community, that states, federal facilities, and personnel shall be good neighbors and citizens to the citizens they serve and in the communities where they located and operate. Feds Feed Families is one of these such efforts. So Feds Feed Families raises the awareness, but we want to go beyond that to actual practices within the federal government. It's very important to partnerships with our communities. And you can see why a significant influence, we can have a significant influence on food recovery. So that brings us to our first presentation. And our first presentation has 2 speakers. The Natural Resource Defense Council's 5-point plan for reducing wasted food at a federal level. Our Joanne Berkenkamp is our first speaker, and they will be going back and forth, I believe, speaking. Joanne is a senior advocate with Food and Agriculture Program at NRDC. There she focuses on wasted food issues, particularly prevention and recovery, to connect surplus foods with people in need. She has worked in food systems development around the country for the past 2 decades and has a master's in public policy from Harvard University. Darby Hoover is a senior resource specialist with NRDC's Food and Agriculture Program. She specializes in issues related to composting, anaerobic digestion, food waste reduction, solid waste management, recycling, and sustainable packaging. Darby coordinates NRDC's national solid waste and recycling initiatives, assists in public and private sector implementation of zero waste, recycling, and composting strategies, and oversees legislative work related to solid waste. I will pass the presentation back to you for now. Kurt,
Great, and this is Joanne Berkenkamp from the Natural Resources Defense Council. Thank you for the introduction, Marlene. So I am part of NRDC's food waste team. And as you may know, NRDC is a large nonprofit environmental organization, and we work on a wide range of issues from climate change to oceans to wildlife, various other issues, as well as food and agriculture, including food waste issues. And we've been doing some planning in view of the executive order and the new national food waste goal around how we might support federal agencies as you all think about how to implement that executive order. And we've developed a 5-point plan that we hope might help you all think about how to pursue that in some pretty practical and tangible ways. And we look forward to talking with you this morning about that. As Marlene mentioned, my colleague Darby and I will both be sort of switching back and forth as we move into the presentation. So Chris, you can move us to the next slide. Great. So just to recap a little bit about why the issue of wasted food matters, not only in government, but really throughout society. If you look at the food system as a whole, about 40% of the food that is produced in the United States goes to waste. And that reflects kind of a soup to nuts perspective all the way from the farm down to the fork at the consumer level. So 40% is a huge number, and it has a lot of consequences. That food is worth about $162 billion, just the part that's going to waste. And I think that number really illustrates that the wasting food is costly, whether you're a consumer wasting it at home, whether it happens on the farm, or whether, as with many of you, you're operating in food service environments where you're paying for that food and then seeing a significant portion of it go to waste. So the economic consequences are significant. Secondly, there are a lot of environmental consequences. Wasted food uses about 25% of the fresh water that's used in the United States every year. That's 25% just for the food that goes to waste, not for all of agriculture. Wasted food also accounts for about 4% of the energy that's used in the United States. The greenhouse gas emissions associated with food waste equate to about 33 million cars on the road per year. So the climate consequences are significant. And then also when you start looking at some of the social consequences, you know, we have about 50 million people in the United States who are food insecure. About 15 million of those food insecure people are children. And if we could reduce our food waste by about 15% and redirect it to people in need, that would equate to enough food to provide the total diets every single day for 25 million Americans every year. That would address about half of the people in the United States who are food insecure. So the potential social benefits from doing better on food waste reduction are also really substantial. So there are a lot of reasons to be concerned about this. And Chris, let's go on to the next slide.
And this is Darby. Thanks, Joanne. So as Joanne mentioned, why wasted food matters. It's a resource use issue. It's a social issue, solving hunger. 1 in 6, as Joanne said, 1 in 6 Americans is currently food insecure, meaning they lack a secure supply of food to their tables. Another issue is related to climate and global warming consequences of wasting food. So as Marlene pointed out, food waste is still the largest component of what's going into disposal. That's landfilling and incinerators in the U.S. 21% of what ends up in that is food. And of course, when food waste goes into a landfill, it generates methane. So 35 million tons or more of food waste that ended up discarded in 2013 created at least 25 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent methane emissions. So that, even just the landfill component, is significant contributor from food waste. So it's obviously an imperative to make sure we find alternate solutions. We're doing better at composting and recycling food waste. We're still only up to 5% recovery on all food discarded. So there's a lot of room for improvement. Next slide, please. So we talked a lot about the Executive Order 13693. The part that NRDC got excited about was the specific call out for food waste, so including food and compostable material. So to us, this really acknowledges that particular burden that food waste disposal is placing on all those different systems and the need to address that specifically. So that's where we think their particular action could make a difference. And of course, the new national goals to reduce food waste that were announced by EPA, USDA, and the Obama administration, I think really provide not only momentum, but a really ambitious but doable target of reducing that food waste by 50% by 2030. So we're very much looking forward to figuring out ways that we can help support that goal. I suggest that other folks might be able to mute in between other presenters, getting some background noise. And then next slide, please. And as we noted, even just 4 agencies provide purchases of food that are equivalent to $4.3 billion and 4.7 billion pounds of food per year. So that's just with the 4 major food purchasing agencies. So federal actions have a significant influence, not just in the sheer quantity of food waste that can be reduced and diverted, but federal actions also can really influence municipal government and the private sector by showing examples and by providing tools. So by setting goals, collecting data, these are all ways that federal agencies can have a significant influence on food recovery. Also through contracted food services by requiring food reduction and recovery practices in the contracts. And adopting comprehensive action strategies that in many ways will provide models for others. And just as a personal note, I have been involved in recycled paper industry and advocating for recycled paper for many years. And one thing that I found very significant was in the 90s when there were executive orders on requiring the federal government to purchase paper with a certain minimum of recycled content, even though the federal government represented, I think, about 2% of total purchasing of paper at that time. Those guidelines influenced the entire paper industry's output and what kinds of products were being offered to both the public and private sector. So I have seen firsthand the power of the federal government with following something like an executive order guideline to really set an example that other private and public sector organizations can and do follow. Next slide.
All right. So this is Joanne again. So now we want to talk a little bit about how to actually pursue that objective, that quite ambitious goal around a 50% reduction in food waste. So one of the tools that we, and I think many people in the food waste world, find particularly helpful is this image from EPA. And it really is kind of the standard that everyone uses when they think about, okay, you want to reduce food waste, how can you go about it, where do you start? So if you look at this food recovery hierarchy emblem, the most preferred strategies for reducing food waste are at the top, and the least preferred are at the bottom. And you can see the landfilling piece is the least preferred, but it's what happens to about 95% of the food that gets wasted and disposed of through the municipal solid waste system. So when we think about how to reduce our food waste, we would start at the top of the hierarchy. You see the purple band at the top that says source reduction. So that really is about preventing food waste in the first place. That's about keeping it from going to waste through all sorts of techniques that we'll talk about. And when you look at the potential for things like food service operations to save money, the savings are also typically happening at the source reduction level. Often when you reduce the amount of food that you're wasting, you can therefore, in fact, be buying less food, and it can have some pretty significant positive impacts on your budgets. So that's where the cost savings come from, and it's the best place to start, also from an environmental perspective and so forth, that we are trying to avoid all those natural resources going into the production of food that then goes to waste. So we always start with reduction. Then, in that blue band, the second one toward the top, you see feeding hungry people. So in situations where you've got, for instance, food in the back of the kitchen that's been prepared but isn't being served, you can't use it for whatever reason, but it's entirely wholesome and appropriate for humans, can see that food be donated, getting to people in need to address some of our issues around food insecurity in the United States. So that donation piece is really the next tier of action. When you move beyond that, if you have food that for some reason cannot be donated or that is not edible, not appropriate for human consumption, the next best use would be feeding animals. And there's a lot of that goes on, for instance, in the food manufacturing world. There's a lot of product that comes out of processing plants that can't be used for whatever reason and goes into animal feed. So that's a good alternative if it's not appropriate for human consumption. And then as you move down the hierarchy, you see other uses like industrial uses. Rendering is a good example of that, or strategies like anaerobic digestion and composting. And then as we mentioned, landfilling, which is mostly what we do, is really the last preferred option for dealing with the food waste that we have. So let's take a look at the next slide. Great. So in terms of where to go with food waste reduction, we feel like it really is a triple bottom line solution. that it benefits people. When you reduce that loss and get it to people in need, it benefits our environment, and it can also have a very direct beneficial impact on governmental budgets. Now that said, federal action is critical, but it's not all up to you, right? It's really about strategies that are rooted in collaborations among government, businesses like food service management companies, your partners that are actually running those operations, and among consumers. And consumers have a big role to play in this as well. So we have developed a 5-point plan at NRDC that we hope can help get you there. And Darby's going to tell us a little bit about what that plan looks like. So Chris, let's move on to the next slide.
So our 5-point plan, we believe, encourages the adoption of strategies that reflect the full spectrum of the waste prevention and recovery and recycling strategies that Joanne just outlined that are captured in EPA's food recovery hierarchy. So federal agencies that make significant food purchases can develop these strategies, reduce wasted food, contribute to executive order implementation, contribute to promotion of the national goals by implementing 5 points. The first of these points is baseline measurement. So agencies should determine the current baseline of wasted food, including how much food is generated as waste each year, assess current management methods for wasted food, including quantifying how much edible food is being recovered for donation, how much, if any, wasted food is being sent to animal feed, composting or anaerobic digestion, and how much is being disposed by landfilling or incineration. So we've talked a lot about the various tools that are available, and EPA has some great tools for this. The EPA's Food and Packaging Waste Prevention Tool, Food Waste Management Calculator, joining the Food Recovery Challenge, Federal Green Challenge, and many are participating in WasteWise. All of those tools can help baseline and improve management methods. I would also suggest, if you don't already, reaching out to haulers to ensure that in contracts you specify the need to measure as much as possible what's being discarded and to which destination, so that your haulers should be able to give you information on how much food waste is being disposed of. And that can be sometimes tricky to tease out compared to other kinds of organics that you might be disposing of for composting in particular. So it's really important to use some of these more upstream methods of measurement as well. Next slide.
All right, so the second step that we advocate is really focusing on procurement, and not only with food and packaging, but also in the way that you set up contracts with your food service management providers, because that's really where you have leverage. So on the food and packaging side, a good starting point is really to identify areas where you may be over-purchasing in ways that contribute to waste, and then adopting systems to monitor the relationship between how you purchase food and foods that go to waste over time. So, that can look like things like really identifying what's going to waste and why. Is it inventory practices? Is it procurement practices? Are there things that you can do with menuing, for instance, to make sure that you're turning over what you have in your inventory most effectively, particularly with highly perishable items, to reduce spoilage and that kind of thing. Another element is instituting more accurate forecasting systems around what kinds of foods you'll need when, and then working with your suppliers to institute just-in-time purchasing systems that allow you as much flexibility as possible to keep the food that's coming in the door in sync with the food that is going out of the door to your customers who are eating in your cafeterias and so forth. Lastly, it can be very helpful to start looking at things like purchasing compostable food packaging. As folks start thinking about how to compost, one of the challenges we often see is that it's just more complicated to separate food from the packaging or the trays, the serviceware and so forth that is also on the plate or on the tray. And so moving toward compostable food packaging supports the overall objective of moving more into composting and getting those materials out of the landfill. So let's take a look at the next slide. So the second piece that I mentioned is the food service management contracts that you as agencies utilize to have those companies come in and handle your cafeteria operations and so forth. So one of the most helpful things that you can do is incorporating a preference for those vendors who make a commitment to preventing and diverting or recycling food waste and putting that into your bid specifications and also the protocols that you use for assessing the bids that you receive. That really is the foundation to getting those changes into place, for identifying vendors who are really on board, who have the capacity to do these sorts of things, and have the commitment to really follow through effectively on it. And then secondly, as you identify those vendors, incorporating food waste prevention, donation, and diversion goals into your contracts. And I have to say, it's really at that moment when you're contracting, when you have the most leverage. It is more challenging if you're in the middle of a 5-year contract, for instance, to have your vendors change their practices. There's some leverage you might have there, but it's a whole lot easier to do it at the outset and to select those vendors that you know really have a track record for food waste reduction and the commitment and capacity to do that well. So the contracting process is critical to improving food waste reduction strategies within your agencies. So let's move on to the next slide if you could, Chris. Great. So then in terms of the third element of this 5-point plan, we really focus on food service management operations in a very practical sense. So there are a lot of tools, as Darby mentioned, to help with this. EPA's Reducing Wasted Food and Packaging Toolkit is fantastic, and it has a lot of very practical strategies, as well as spreadsheets and so forth, to think about how you can adopt practices to reduce your food waste. So a key one is food storage and inventory management. So it will reduce your costs if you can identify a way to store foods to maximize your food shelf, food life. And then monitoring and utilizing inventories, particularly of perishable items, so that the smallest amount possible is going to waste. And those inventories are managed to maximize turnover of those perishables. Secondly, there are strategies like menu planning and portion sizing that can really help. So things like designing menus and portion sizes to maximize the flexibility that you have in using your perishable foods. So for instance, you may be serving sauteed zucchini or cauliflower on one day. If you can design your sequence of menus so that you can put any leftovers into a soup or a casserole on the following day, that will help you reduce your food losses and bring your budget down. So there are things that you can do on the menu planning front that really can help you leverage the food that otherwise might go to waste and then becomes a resource on the next day for the menu items that you have planned. Similarly with portion sizing, we hear a lot about people just feeling like portion sizes are simply too large, and that contributes to a lot of plate waste on the post-consumer side. So I think there are always things that can be done to really think your portion sizes with what people actually want to eat. To think about, optional side dishes, ways of making sure people actually want the food before that it's served to them. And that can really also help reduce your food budgets. Next item would be food recovery and repurposing. So repurposing excess foods for use in future meals, as I mentioned, like that sauteed zucchini. If you can find a way to use it again, potatoes can be used effectively that way. A whole series of things can be used that way. So the repurposing piece is important, but then when you have, for instance, maybe whole pans of lasagna that have not been served, they're still in the kitchen, things like that can be so safely donated. And, it's very interesting if you look at some of the large food service management companies nationally, they really are starting to think more about donation. Someone like Compass Group, they own Bon Appetit Food Service Management Company. Bon Appetit has made a commitment that 80% of their accounts nationally will be certified for food recovery by the year 2018. So they're moving very aggressively toward this donation issue. They've worked out concerns about liability. They are working out the mechanics of it, how you get it transported and maintain the cold chain and so forth. So I think as Bon Appetit moves more fully into the food donation space, many other food service management companies will come along, and the level of comfort with donation will really increase here over the next couple of years. And I suspect that within the next 2 or 3 years, the landscape will feel very differently around donation. I think we're in a phase now where there's a lot of concern about liability. Folks are not clear about how they connect with a food bank or a food pantry in their community to donate that product and get it safely transported. And I have to say, I do think those things are being worked out, and I think federal agencies will really be beneficiaries of those strategies as they become more mainstreamed. And I think those efforts to donate can be really fantastic as a way to engage in your community. Employee morale really benefits when people feel like that extra food is being donated, and it reduces your landfilling costs. So it's good on multiple fronts. And then lastly, on the food service management side, I would just flag staff education. It's really important that your folks feel bought in, that they feel taken into account, that they help drive the process, and that they understand why it's helpful from social, economic, and economic concerns. So there are a lot of practical, easy ways to educate people, and it's important that folks feel bought in. So that needs to be an integral piece of these efforts. And Chris, let's just move to the next slide now.
Thanks, Chris. So the final step to adhere to the strategies outlined in the food recovery pyramid is to commit to collecting and recycling any wasted food that can't be reduced or recovered for donation. Now let's unpack this a little bit. We talked about the importance of getting baseline measurements earlier, performing a waste audit, otherwise figuring out what's currently happening in terms of what kinds of waste you're generating and what kinds of waste you're disposing and the quantities of those. It's also important to conduct an inventory of your existing waste infrastructure so evaluate how you're currently managing compostable items. If you're already collecting them, evaluate how that collection is coordinated alongside recycling and garbage collection so that you can determine the potential to expand that or otherwise figure out how to roll out a new program. So you need to determine infrastructure, resources, staff time that are currently devoted to anything related to waste management, and then the available resources, budget, infrastructure, staff time, and space that's available for any potential expansion. That includes space in buildings and loading docks, et cetera, so that you could talk about expanding a program. You also need to figure out whether your existing waste or recycling hauler could handle your organic waste, or if you need to locate another hauler. And work with those haulers to ask whether there are certain types of organics they don't accept and requirements to put organics in certain containers or leave them in particular locations. So just be aware that all those logistics can be worked out. In addition, I would suggest negotiating a specific composting hauling contract, which then gets integrated into your overall waste budget, but asking the hauler while negotiating that contract to break out very clearly the different costs in the contracts that include hauling and landfill disposal fees, that include amounts of waste collected and so forth, so that you can use those data in tracking your progress. And then you want to figure out in your facility if you need to map out additional composting receptacle and signage needs. So one thing that I would strongly recommend wherever possible is co-locating bins so that folks are disposing of something that don't look around and say, oh, I've got this in my hand that it needs to go in this bin, but I only see this other bin, so that's where it goes. If you're doing prep work in kitchens, it can be easier to figure out how to allocate bins next to where prep is taking place, but you'll need to consider whether you're trying to incorporate any post-consumer food waste recovery as well as pre-consumer that happens in kitchens. So all of this needs to get determined on a case-by-case basis, and figuring out how to clearly and visibly identify all of the different receptacles and locations for organic waste helps to use a combination of image and words. It helps to brand it consistently throughout an organization, and figure out what educational materials you need in order to make sure that folks are on board, so that there's training for staff and other kinds of education around separation and recycling. And then you want to ensure that any food serviceware or packaging that's going to get collected for composting is compliant with ASTM, American Society of Testing Materials, compostability specifications. The easiest way to do that is to rely on certification by BPI, the Biodegradable Products Institute. So you want to make sure that it's any serviceware or packaging that you're using that's designated as compostable is compatible not only with those specifications, but with your particular compost company's processes and their specifications, which can vary from facility to facility. So it's very important to test your products with your composter to ensure that those work and that you collect materials in a way that works for your hauler. So that's going to vary slightly from hauler to hauler and from composter to composter. So it's important to have that be a feedback mechanism between your vendor, your purchasers, your facilities managers, and your haulers and composters. And then, of course, This is, again, something that we want to make sure is a last step after we've prioritized reducing and preventing food waste, using it as animal feed, and prior to that, of course, donating where possible for people to eat. So composting and anaerobic digestion are going to be possibly the last strategy that you employ, although in many cases you're going to actually end up employing these concurrently. So think about ways to allocate your available budget and resources throughout all those different aspects of the pyramid, and make sure that you're not spending your entire budget on composting and leaving out something you could be doing to support waste prevention. And of course, measure, measure, measure. Next slide. Great. So tagging off of the first slide where we said to get baseline measurements, what you can, of course, do with your baseline measurements is use them to develop quantitative improvement goals and implementation plans for how to advance even more preventing, recovering, and recycling food waste. And develop meaningful benchmarks against these goals so that you can measure over time, commit to annual performance reporting, as I know you are already doing, and I think that's one thing that NRDC is very interested in, is following up to look at agency implementation plans and highlight some of the better practices that we see being employed, so that we can share those among other public agencies as well as private sector. And again, as we've noted before, there are a number of tools available and measurement protocols that can help you along the way. I'd also like to note that NRDC is available for next steps. Next slide. Here's the contact information for both myself and my colleague Joanne. We're very happy to help review any agency plans along these lines. We're going to hope to follow up by sending out a copy of a full version of our 5-point plan if folks are interested. We have additional materials and additional supporting documents if you'd like additional assistance with this. But we want to thank you for taking this into consideration and walking through this with us, and we all look forward to meeting the % reduction goal together. Thank you.
Great. This is Bree Bill from EPA Region 5. Thanks so much, Joanne and Darby. I have to say, I was just really blown away at those first couple of slides with just how much food is wasted, and what could be done if we even decreased food waste by 15%. It's just amazing to me. I'd like to open the time up here for questions. If people would like to enter a question from their dashboard into the little questions chat box, we can kind of go from there. And Marlene, do you have anything that you want to comment on or add to?
I do. I know there are a number of places and things that we can show for more information. If I could just take over for a second on the slide presentation, I have 4 publications that I just want to show people that can help them understand in depth what Darby and Joanne were talking about. So I think you can see it now. One place to find out more about Feeding America is Feeding America, the organization. This is the first brochure or guide that will tell you what you can do and how you can find places to volunteer and donate food, and some of the things like the Good Samaritan Act that will enable you to have less liability. That's one of the online market, Feeding America. A second one on Food Donation Association. It goes in depth about all of the different specifications for donating food. And let me put there. And that's a very good publication. Restaurateur's Guide. And then USDA Feeding the Hungry and Reducing Solid Waste Through Food Recovery with EPA. another publication. And then ones that are going to be CDC, GSA, and HHS and interagency group are working on updating the health and sustainability guidelines for the new executive order and for different types of food recovery. So that's all I have right now. We can put up our last question and answers. And did we get any more questions? I know there.
Actually, what happened was I was getting some emails to my email account. A couple people said that they couldn't see the question box, and that's my fault. I apologize. It should be toggled back on right now for people to enter questions. And while we're waiting for that, I did get a question from somebody on an email, so I'm just going to throw that out. Joanne or Darby, do you have any idea of the percent of wasted food generated by federal entities? This is from an EPA person.
I don't think we have that specific number. Unfortunately, even the way that the EPA tracks discarded food is slightly different than the way that they track some other materials, and it relies a lot on specific audits in specific locations. So I haven't seen a number specifically on disposal from federal agencies of food in particular.
Okay, an audit of 150. Can you hear me?
Yes, this is Joanne. I just had a response to that question. That's all right?
Oh. Okay, I had something too.
Okay, go ahead.
An audit of 150 GSA facilities nationwide in 2013, I believe, showed that food waste and compostable packaging accounted for 20% of the total landfill waste stream, or more than 5,000 tons per year.
Good. Okay. I also understand that government food procurement accounts for about 5% of food use in the United States, so about 5% of total food purchases. And then the numbers on kind of where food waste happens in our country are something of a moving target. We're all, I think, working toward getting better and better data about where food losses occur. But our understanding of the current data is that about 40% occurs at the consumer level in the home. 40%, so the consumer piece is huge. Retail, or restaurants rather, are roughly 30%. Retail is about 10%, although it gets a lot of attention in the media. Food service environments like cafeterias and hospitals and schools and colleges and so forth is another 10% roughly. And then when you look further back up the supply chain toward processing and on-farm food waste, the portion of food that actually ends up getting landfilled through municipal solid waste is actually quite small. And that's not to say that the losses aren't occurring there, but for instance, on farms, often that product is not making it out of the field and isn't being accounted for. Or with food processing and manufacturing, a lot of the waste that occurs there is going into animal feed, for instance, and not into landfill. So it looks like if you look at the entire food service sector, it's about 10% of the food that gets wasted annually in the country.
Okay. I think that our question box is working properly, but I am not seeing any questions. Let me look real quick.
Bree, this is Chris. There are several questions that have come into the question box.
Would you mind reading them? I'm not seeing them at all.
Okay, no problem. Okay, another question. Where does the use of biodigester for food waste fit into this, i.e. better to dump waste there or feed people with waste?
This is Darby. I'm happy to take that. So biodigester, and I think the broader sort of term of digestion, anaerobic. In NRDC's perspective, this is a form of organics recycling with energy recovery. So from NRDC's perspective, that's equivalent to composting on the hierarchy. The way that I would characterize the digestion piece is that you have the opportunity to control the decomposition process of the food in a way that allows you to extract energy from it, but that the primary ecological benefit that's still associated with food scrap recycling is going to be the recycling of the nutrients that are incorporated into that food back into soils wherever possible. And in addition, there are other soil benefits that are associated with composting, such as increased ability to retain water, improved soil structure, increased ability to hold nutrients. So there's a number of reasons that we want to ensure that any food waste that is recycled either through composting or through anaerobic digestion is that the result of that process is something that turns out that we can use as a soil amendment. So I would say that that's the key thing to keep in mind. Again, I would note that that's a strategy that we want to employ after we've employed reduction, prevention, and recovery strategies to the extent feasible. And animal feed is also a tier that's higher than either composting or anaerobic digestion. The other thing I would note about digestion is, again, once you've undergone the process of energy extraction through digestion, you're left with a solid and or liquid digestate that then typically needs to be treated in some manner before it's usable as a soil amendment. So two things to keep in mind there. One is to ensure that there's a back-end process for directing that digestate to composting or some other treatment so that it becomes suitable for digestion or for soil amendment. And then the first is to ensure that you're putting the right things into your digester so that you have something that's coming out the back end that's not so contaminated that you aren't able to use it as soil amendment. I don't think we get the gains from anaerobic digestion if we end up with a digestate that's got to go to landfill, for example. So ensuring a relatively clean feedstock. Most digester processes work very well for food waste, not as well for lignocellulosic materials like food packaging or landscaping waste. So depending on your technology and the process you're using, you want to ensure that digestion is part of a robust organics recycling system that may also include composting, that may also include something like a mulch facility, and so forth.
Okay. We have another question about if the slides will be available to the attendees. We have been recording this, and a recording of the session will be available, but I don't know, Marlene, Darby, Joanne, will slides be available separately?
This is Joanne. Our slides certainly can be. Marlene, at your end, do you have an easy way to make those available to the people on the call or others?
You may be muted, Marlene.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. We post them on the webinar page for the Federal Green Challenge Webinar Academy.
Okay.
That's yes.
All right, they will be available.
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you.
The next question is, where does food purchase and tonnage data come from? With a follow-up as to what does the acronym BN mean?
Oh, I think
BN was billion. Yeah, that's probably from our slides. So I think the BN was billion. And the question is probably where did those numbers come from on the agency purchases? And Joanne, I think you had that.
Yeah, so that 4.27 billion figure is data that NRDC pulled together for those 4 agencies, which we identified as among the largest purchasers in the federal government. And we were in touch with various government folks to try to do some extrapolations to identify those numbers. So they're estimates in most cases, and I think if anything, they're probably quite conservative.
And again, the agencies that were referred to there were USDA, Department of Defense, Bureau of Prisons, and Veterans Affairs.
Yeah.
Okay, next question. Do either of you have any experience, or can you make any comments with respect food digesters as a food waste reduction measure?
I'm pretty sure that that was what was covered in the previous question. So if someone has an additional question that I didn't just take away too much time to go on about earlier, then please clarify that.
Okay. And do either of the EPA participants, any of the EPA participants want to jump in on the food digester question?
Not here. It sounds like they're...
Chris or Marlene? Okay.
No, I
All
don't.
right. Does EPA have a list of large-scale composting facilities with sound environmental siting? In Maryland, there are not many or any options for large-scale composting of food and other organic waste. And I'm assuming that's something that we'll have to get back to you about, Ed.
Bree, this is Chris. I'd like to add there's a website out there. It's findacomposter.com that's run by Biocycle Magazine. Not that that's an endorsement. They're tracking this information, and you can go on to the website and find composters near you based on material or zip code. Another place to check on information for that is your state regulatory agency that regulates composting and the siting of the compost sites. That would be a way to get a list from the state as well. The federal EPA doesn't have any permitting authority for composting, so it's done at the local.
The whole national capital area here, including Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, are working on, especially in Maryland, they're working on different codes and regulations in order to open additional composting facilities. I know there are a few that are being used right now, and there's a couple near Richmond. There's Prince George's County, but they are very stringent in what they pick up. Only compostable bags, and they don't allow much, of course, contamination. Then there's a couple, I probably shouldn't mention the name, but there's a smaller business model that are starting to open smaller facilities throughout the area, so that the economy of scale will be taken care of in that way, and it won't get too big, and they are composting and selling the compost rather than just picking up the tipping fees. So the Municipal Washington Council of Governments and the Northern Virginia Waste group are all working on those things. So those are the two places to get more information on what's actually open now. You mentioned Maryland, so I thought I'd chime in. Is there another question?
Yes. Can one of the speakers talk more about the liability aspect?
Sure. This is Joanne at NRDC. So, you know, this issue around liability concerns for food donation is really widespread. And in a way, it's a little bit ironic because the United States, since I think 1996 or 97, has had liability protection at the federal level that really is the envy of the world. And our colleagues in Europe, for instance, tell us all the time that they would love to have what we have in the United States. It's the Bill Emerson Good Samaritan Act. And basically what it says is that if an entity gives food in a state of goodwill to a nonprofit organization, they cannot be held liable. And it's a gross negligence standard, which means that someone would have to demonstrate that you willfully donated food that was unsafe in order to be held liable. And to our understanding, there has never been not only a successful lawsuit, but any lawsuit under that statute. So the liability protection really is quite comprehensive. I think the level of awareness of that is actually pretty low in the United States. We have this great statute, and the people just are not aware of it. But you're seeing large corporations, as their legal counsels become comfortable with this and they understand the extent of the protection, they're starting to move much more aggressively into the donation space. And another issue I think that's often related to the concern about liability, people talk about it as liability, but I think maybe sometimes, at least you see in the corporate sector, the concern more is just protection of their name and of their brand, that they just see a risk of being associated with any potential problems that might happen. But even in that regard, we're seeing in food service environments that if you're working through really professional organizations,
so that you could see what it was.
If you're working through organizations that really manage the linkage between you and your cafeterias and the organizations that actually receive it, like shelters that might actually be serving that food, that there are definitely very practical, known ways of, for instance, making sure that the cold chain is maintained, that food is safe, that the people who are in the middle of the chain who are handling it, for instance, will have gone through safe food handling trainings and are certified, that the organizations receiving it are certified. Even strategies like having the entity that picks up the food from your kitchen taking the temperature before it leaves your premises to show that it was at an appropriate temperature and was safe when it left your possession, that can create a lot of comfort because it says that you were doing the right thing. So it's a big question. I think it's largely, often those concerns are really not really founded in law, and so we need to contribute to this effort on our part at NRDC and with other nonprofit organizations, I think, and really helping folks understand what the protections are and how they can make sure that that food is safe when it's in their own facilities and after it leaves your facilities.
Thank you. We had a request from someone, Marlene, if you might be able to include some of the links to the EPA tools. And there may have been a slide on that. If there is, Chris can probably backtrack and get to it. If there's not, is there something you can type into the chat box?
There should be, there are links on one of the slides, but when you get the slides, all of those are links, and there it is on the screen now. Can you see that? Can you still see my screen?
Yeah, yes.
Okay.
Okay, great. Let me go on to the next question while people are looking at that. There was a news story recently that EPA underestimates the total volume or weight by about 50%. Do you think the waste composition percentage is shown in your chart? I'm assuming, not sure if the person is talking about EPA's chart or NRDC's chart, is accurate regardless of the total.
I don't know what chart we're talking about.
I'm not sure either. We might be able to get back to you on that, the person who submitted this question. Okay. There are several. Oh, go ahead. Sorry. There are several follow-ups on the anaerobic digester question. I'm just going to read them off. Follow-up question on anaerobic digestion. If the digester discharges to sewer and wastewater treatment facilities, does this reduce the compostability, diversion from landfill, and soil amendment benefits of digestion and composting?
That is a good question. So there are a number of different kinds of digesters, and some digesters, I think in the U.S., we've already got the most digesters employed at wastewater treatment plants. So what those are doing is handling our sewage right now. In many cases, folks are considering or already adding food waste to those digesters at sewage treatment plants in order to improve the process, and it does, I think, in many ways enhance the performance of the digester to add food waste. I understand that you get a sort of a more robust process that results in more energy extraction and so forth. In terms of the output, what you've got then is a biosolids material, and my understanding is that you've got a variety of biosolids regulations throughout the U.S. that control the deployment of any kind of biosolids material. It sounds like Marlene may know a little more about this. So depending on which kind of class you're achieving, if it's a Class A product, you can actually sell it as packaged in a store to home consumers. other classes of biosolids may not be able to be used in the same kind of way. So you're able to use those products in different ways depending on what kind of rating they've achieved. But I do think, you know, given that we're only managing to divert about 5% of food waste right now, my initial take on this is there's enough to put it everywhere. So there's enough to add to some of the existing wastewater digesters. There's enough to add to composting. There's enough to add to, you know, to have dedicated digesters just for food waste. We should be exploring all those solutions right now. And in many communities, they've already got a digester. That's a quick and easy way to you know, they can upgrade that digester at the wastewater treatment plant to handle some food waste. That's a good way to get started. And then down the road, they could explore, do we need to add capacity in terms of additional food waste dedicated digesters, in terms of, you know, adding food waste composting or other kinds of solutions.
Okay, thank you. The last comment on digesters, and this is related to those that are installed in kitchens, and I think it's more of a comment than a question, but that there's concerns with complying with EOD limits in the sanitary sewer regulated by local municipalities. This technology is different from waste to energy technology discussed by the briefer, I think the speaker.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a little bit of a confusing array of processes and technologies out there right now. So some pieces of equipment that I'm seeing in restaurants and so forth that are being called digesters are not strictly digesters. Some of them are essentially advanced incinerator type food waste in-sink disposal units. So some of those are grinding and transporting food waste to a digester via the water pipes, or the outflow water. You know what I'm talking about. So you're using water to take that to the sewage treatment plant, or to another type of digester. And the questioner is absolutely correct that you've got to make sure that you're compliant with your local water board and your local other agencies' regulations on what you can put down the drain, and ensuring that you're not overloading that system with that particular kind of technology. And I would also suggest that right now in California, using water to transport food to a treatment facility may not be the most environmentally sensitive option in places where you're in a drought situation or have other types of water restrictions, or you have restrictions on what kinds of organic load can go into your system. You've got to be careful with that kind of system. The other kinds of systems that I've seen that are on site are often various types of systems that essentially grind and sometimes dewater food waste. Many of those, although they say that they can treat waste on site, don't come up with a product that is biologically stable enough to use as a soil amendment direct out of the box. But they can serve a purpose of enabling greater on-site storage, enabling a longer time before you've got to get that material picked up, and so forth. So there are a number of growing options in that arena on how you can collect food waste at a facility.
Okay, thank you. Darby or Joanne, did either one of you happen to mention about 40% of food wasted was household waste, or from households?
Consumer,
or 40% of household food is wasted?
What the food industry can do most optimally to reduce food waste through prevention and donation and recycling efforts. So Deloitte has been working to work with this very broad, heterogeneous, sometimes conflicting array of data that is available about food waste. So they really have been doing kind of a compilation in an effort to reconcile different data sources. And so they believe it's between 25 and 50%, somewhere probably around 40% is what they're seeing at the consumer level. So I think those numbers are going to continue to evolve. We'll have some further data coming out in the first quarter of 2016 that we hope will describe the whole food system and where those particular losses are occurring. So I would say it's an estimate. We believe it's a pretty good one, and we'll continue to work on honing that data.
Joanne, could you clarify if the 25 to 40% means 25 to 40% of all food that's wasted is happening at the consumer level, or whether it means 25 to 40% of all food purchased by a consumer ends up as waste?
No, it means of all the food that gets wasted, 25 to 50% is happening at the consumer level, as opposed to, you know, retail, food service, on the farm, so forth.
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, and we estimate, so in relative to the question of how much of a consumer's food is typically being wasted in the home. So for many of us, we're wasting around 20 to 25% of the food that we purchase and bring home. Yeah, and that typically in a family of four equates to about $1,500 a year in food that we purchase and then waste at home.
Okay, thank you. It looks like we are out of questions. Let me just double check. Marlene, do you want to wrap up?
Also, I will wrap up. I just want to say thank you for Darby and Joanne for a wonderful presentation. I've posted up on my screen the Sustainable Food Management webpage for EPA. I hope you can see it. And that's where you can get further information. We hope to have further webinars, both in our Food Recovery Challenge and our Federal Green Challenge, on this up-and-coming way for us to increase our waste diversion and food recovery. So stay tuned for that and check back on the Federal Green Challenge website for future webinars. Thanks again to Bree and Chris for hosting this, and you can still send in questions that you may have, and we will post what we have for this webinar on our Federal Green Challenge webinar homepage. Thank you, and have a good rest of the week.